Welcome to the British Empire Study Group's September 3rd meeting. Thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank the Collectors Club for the use of their Zoom. Very helpful. My name is Joan Harmer. I am the co-chair of the British Empire Study Group. Tonight we have with us Robert Gray, who is my counterpart, the other co-chair of the British Empire Study Group. And that's among many other positions. He is a governor at the Collectors Club, and he has collected postal history for about 20 years, and he's a member of many other Indian groups. We are also very fortunate to have with us Markan Dav. He's from India, and he's in India right now, so I thank him for waking up so early. As for those of you who are not familiar with him, he is an expert on Indian philately. And it would probably be easier to tell you what group he's not a part of. He is a fellow of the Royal. And if you want a great picture, look on his Facebook and you'll see him with the Queen. He is also the commissioner of the Morocco 2021. And I believe there's one other Indian show that I forgot. Markan, what is the other show that you're?
Villa Virtue, that is the international online exhibition.
Yeah, that's a wonderful place. So tonight's topic is World War I civil internment mail in India, 1914 to 1919, and that is going to be presented by Robert Gray. So for those of you who are not familiar with the British Empire Study Group, we are one of several groups that meet in the Collectors Club when we can go to the Collectors Club. The British Empire is obviously a very large topic, and we're a very liberal group, and the topics that we consider are pretty broad. So the purpose of our group is really to promote the exchange of information between the presenters and the audience. So we tend to be a bit more interactive than some of the other presentations that you may see. In this vein, we're going to do something a bit different from what you may be used to. We are using the webinar format, as the Collectors Club does. It's a great format. The panelists can't see you, but you can see them. Trying to make it more like our in-person meetings, what I'd like to do is first of all, we have Markan here who will jump in if there are some questions that he has for Robert. And he might have some further comments that he might want to share, and that's always wonderful. Now, if you want to ask a question to either Robert or Markan, you're going to have two ways to do this. One, you're very familiar with. If you want to stay behind the scenes, you could just put your question in the Q&A and you could remain right where you are. If you feel you'd like to come in and join the conversation, you could raise your hand. That's, for those of you who are not familiar with it, that's the little button on your Zoom. And I'll bring you in and you could ask your question personally. If it gets too big, I might push you out, but at least you could come in and be a little bit more active. After we're all through, we'll bring everybody over and we'll have a nice little social hour. Okay, so lastly, I just want to remind you to mark your calendars for our next meeting, which will be on Thursday, October 15th at 6 o'clock. And the speaker for that meeting will be Paul Barker on the 10-cent small queens and the 17-cent first cent issue of BNA and Canada. So with all that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you, Joan. So, as Joan mentioned, the talk is civil internment mail in India in World War I, and the focus is German and Austrian civilian internees. There were other internees, there were Ottomans, there were hundreds of Indians as well, some of whom were Gadar members, Revolutionary Party members that were restricted to their villages, and some were sent down, if you will, to Port Blair. But there's no postal history from those who were imprisoned. Um, Civil internment, you'll see the phrase, some people say detention centers. Detention implies a shorter term, you know, you were detained by the police, but internment, you're staying there for a long time. So civil internment was under civil law in India at the time, as opposed to military prisoners of war who were held there under military law. And that's a distinction. So the civilians who were held, like I mentioned, Germans, Austrians, and Ottomans, these were the enemy nations fighting the British in World War I. Austria, of course, at the time was most of Eastern Europe, and Germany was much bigger than it is today as well. And the Ottoman Empire went from Saudi Arabia through Iraq and through Turkey. So it was much bigger as well. If you were a resident in India, a woman and a child or a man above military age, because the Germans and Austrians had fixed military ages, then you were considered civilian, and you went, if you were interned, to a civilian camp. If you were a merchant sailor and you were also not of military age, you were also picked up off the boats once you were in Indian waters, and off you went. Enemy nationals that were collected out of any age from war zones were brought to India from Mesopotamia and East Africa, a few from Persia and elsewhere. Again, it went by age. If you were not an Ottoman, they had no military age, so regardless of age, if you were male, you went to a military camp. German civilian residents in Siam, which is Thailand today, they were interned in India after Siam became an ally. So that's like the scope of it. So when you total them all up, there were about 2,000 who were subject to internment. Of these, about 900 were repatriated in 1915 and 1916. These were mostly associated with religious missions, and this repatriation closed many of the smaller camps. There was an agreement between Germany and Great Britain to exchange the missionary people, and that's why this repatriation was restricted primarily to them. There were also about 500 who were allowed to remain at residence. Most were living in nunneries and monasteries. There's no postal history there. And there was a few who, for compassionate reasons, a British wife married to a German, she would get German nationality under British law. They were allowed to stay also. But in all, there were about 600 remained interned during the war. Virtually all were repatriated by December 1919. And as a result, postal history examples of civilian internment are relatively scarce, even as opposed to military internment in India, which there was about 1,500 who were held for the full 50 to 60 months. So again, who were they? They're missionaries, business people, and skilled workers. There were a lot of German steel workers that were in India that were eventually interned but allowed to work as long as they couldn't be replaced. The merchant seamen, including Ottomans and Europeans, were taken from ships. Families and soldiers of German East African Schutztruppe, this is the Home Guard. Men of military age, of course, went to the POW camp, and those brought from Thailand. This was a localized German national residence in Siam. These were people who'd been there long enough not to have a lot of connections with Germany anymore. And there was also military prisoners who aged out. Once you crossed age 45, you were designated as a civilian. So they went to civilian camps. Missionaries were particularly held with suspicion by the British. They were capable of influencing their congregants against British authority. Many of them were quite active in getting German newspapers into India, and some even contacted the German cruiser, the Emden, which had shelled the harbor in Madras. So the missionaries were definitely on the let's lock them up and get rid of them list. The business operators, there was an enemy commercial embargo. They needed to wind down their businesses and stop doing business. And the skilled workers, of course, there was an opportunity for sabotage. They had to be removed. The sailors, they knew about Indian waters, navigation and defenses. This was also a risk. And for some, they lived in areas where there was so much anti-German activity from the British and Indian residents that they had to be interned for their own safety. So I mentioned that there was a repatriation, and several books were written primarily in German about their experience. It was a crummy old ship and crowded and so forth, but it did eventually, in 2 trips, take the missionaries home in November 1915 from the east coast of India, and in April 1916, mostly from the west coast of India. After the Golgonda had dropped off its passengers and was making a return voyage, the Germans sunk the vessel. So a lot of hostility and war. So this is a map showing the location of the prisoner of war camps, the civilian internment centers, that have a postal history, or at least identifiable marks or things that you could say, yes, this was done there. You start with Ahmednagar over here. I sort of mixed my my map skills here. I've used the modern state names, but I've used Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta as anchor points for World War I. That's the old names. Of course, it's Kolkata, Chennai, and Mumbai today. But Ahmednagar was a British fort, and it held 2 camps for military prisoners of war. And about 3 miles from the military camp was the civil camp for men. They were occupying previous infantry or barracks for Indian soldiers. Let me get my, where's my pointer? There it is. Sholapur was where the people from Thailand mostly wound up. Bellary was for women and children. It got emptied after the Golgonda. Belgaum was grew to be the largest of the camps. It was a family camp. And then at the close of the war, it was used for refugees, as was Ahmednagar. These are mostly people fleeing the former Russian Empire. Yerkud, let's see, where's my pointer? Yerkud to the south is like I won't say resort area, but it was a hill station where people would go during the hot weather. It's quite comfortable. And that was initially a family, not a family camp, but for women and children. And then later, after they left, if they were repatriated, it was used for men who aged out of military age. Kodaikanal was another. The area of land below Kodaikanal, this is Sri Lanka today, was Ceylon during the war. And actually, up until the 1960s, it was physically connected by a land bridge to India. It got overwhelmed in a tropical storm, and the land bridge was lost. If you go to the northeast, you have Katapahar, kind of cold up there, this closed, and they moved the people, all of them, about 50 to Takhta. And Dinapur was a place where many missionaries were concentrated for a brief period of time. It's called a concentration camp, but mainly to concentrate them so they could catch the Golgonda at Calcutta. So that's his geographical orientation. So these camps had different openings and closing dates, operating dates, and these are outlined here. And they have identifiers. So Ahmednagar has hand stamps and camp stationery. I really can't call it postal stationery because it doesn't have stamps or postage. But it closes in September 1917. Belgaum, as I said, was a family camp, and it continued after the war. Bellary, this closed with the Golgonda in April. This is in Madras area. Sorry, South India. Katapahar closed, and the people were transferred to Takhta. And you can see this. I don't think I really have to read it all, but you can see some have camp stationery and some just hand stamps. That's what we're dealing with, not a whole lot. There's also, from the National Archives in India, and this is an amazing resource because it's digitally accessible. For the most part, and you can digitize on demand. You have to wait, but they'll do it. And you can go through there and find a tremendous amount of information on postal history and on these camps and other things related to the World War I era, but it goes as expands the whole history of India. So looking through their index for places where there was civil internment of Europeans, to give you some idea, in Assam, Jowari, which is up in the mountains and away from everything, there were 4 former priests that had married Indian ladies. They were put under house arrest. Dinapur I'd mentioned already. Bankura and Berthampur were small camps. Actually, this was the one place where you might get an Ottoman with a European. Kiddapur is a part of Calcutta, Kiddapur House. The sailors were kept there for about a month after they were taken off the German merchant ships, and then eventually moved to Katapahar. Matharan, this is in Bombay province. This is where the German East African ladies came and waited for Belgaum to open. There was 1 or 2 families, German nationals in Burma. They were put under house arrest in Mamio and Shwebo. Whoops, sorry. Nagpur and Jubalapur were briefly held concentration areas before they could find permanent solutions for these people. And in Madras, the same thing here. You have several camps that held small numbers of missionaries. Ramandrug was a rest camp, and after the civilians were done with it, it became a military rest camp. So there is postal history for Ramandrug, but as a internment camp, but it's military. And in the Punjab, was Dakshai, where there's again military correspondence, but it was just temporary for civilians, and only about 15. So a little bit about postal rates. The Hague Convention, 1907, explains a lot what the rights are for military prisoners of war. It doesn't really speak to civilian internees, and the whole world was doing this. But for the most part, countries, especially Great Britain, honored civilians the same way for postal privileges as they would soldiers, and in fact, they were a little more generous. So they had free letter postage and free parcel postage on small packages. Not quite sure what's meant by that, but I've seen one reference to just a couple of ounces, so really small packages. They had a waiver of registration, money order, and insurance fees, so that they wouldn't have to pay for that in their mailings. Inbound mail, if it's from India, you had to have a domestic rate, and if it came from Germany and Austria, there was no postage required. And I've seen, like from East Africa and possibly elsewhere, where postage coming into India to a POW address was required. So I think it's something that's up to the individual country that's sending the letters. So there's, of course, limitations to everything. And the outbound mail had to be left open and was going to be censored by the superintendent or his staff, and franked if necessary. And the reason why the superintendent was putting the stamps on was it was too obvious to write a message under the stamp to avoid the censor and then put the stamp over it. And this is one reason why I think all the sides in the war agreed not to have stamps. So if it's addressed to India, generally there was only camp censorship. If it's addressed elsewhere, there was censorship in London, but this was not consistent. They didn't like the writing of excessive number of letters or very long letters, but in the civil camps, unlike the military, there wasn't a fixed, you can only send so many. All the letters that were not in English had to be sent to the postal censor in Bombay, where there was translators. And all mail had to be posted at the superintendent's office, because you weren't about to, even though these were parole camps for the most part, you couldn't use a regular post office without a special permission. No one has an exact number of how many letters went in and out, but from other Red Cross surveys and Red Cross visits, my best guess would be about 4 letters in and 4 letters out, excluding newspapers and parcels. So about eight letters per month in and out. The routes are pretty straightforward as well. If it's domestic mail, you had a separate bag coming out of the camp. I saw one record where there was actually 2 bags coming out, a morning and an afternoon bag, going to the Indian Post Office. Internationally, it was bagged to Bombay and routed to the War Office in London, and then transferred to a neutral nation such as the Netherlands for delivery. And this is for European mail. Mail between British Empire and Indian internees went through the usual route. So a letter from Ceylon, they wouldn't send necessarily to London. Of course, it would be censored in Ceylon. International inbound mail was censored at the port of entry, and for the civilian internee mail I've seen, that's Bombay or Madras, and at the camp. International Committee of the Red Cross was not involved in this, and it was not involved in the military side. The British wanted to see those letters, and if the Red Cross handled it, they wouldn't have the ability to effectively censor the material. So with that said, you have enough background that we can look at some postal material. This first one is from Ahmednagar, or coming out of Ahmednagar, addressed locally to Bombay. So there's only the camp censor. And you can see the initials JHG. It's Mr. Garrett, who is the superintendent. And he may have had clerks doing some of this as well. But if it's an English letter, they handled it. These covers or scans are courtesy of a friend of mine, Cliff Gregory, who's also collecting in this area, and was kind enough to share this material with me. These are civil detentus letters. Detentus is a Latin word for somebody who's been interned. And you can see on these covers, nicely printed envelopes. They have the camp censor hand stamp, if you will. You can see it over here, it's faint. They have past censor Bombay. You have post-free, past censor prisoner of war. On both these covers, this is just a different camp hand stamp. The EB 476, this is a London mark. And you can see that it's designated as Germany, and quite clear and easy to handle. These covers are pretty scarce. Now, this is a cover from British East Africa to Ahmednagar prisoner of war camp, and it's a military side of Ahmednagar. But if you look at the letter, it says commercial papers registered to a Mr. Rother, Esquire. This is not a soldier, and that's my point, that there were a lot of civilians whom we would consider civilians, who were just happened to be young, that were interned in military camps. Oddly, even though the rule for the camps was the superintendent's supposed to remove the stamps, in this case, thankfully he did not. So what did a civilian internment facility look like? This was the gate at the Belgaum Fort. Belgaum's south of Bombay. It's on the west coast of India, near Goa, if that helps. There were barracks in there. The women shared. These barracks were divided into family units, and this was a parole camp. They could walk into town, but there were certain places like the post office and other areas that were forbidden, and they had to be back by night. There was roll call, but no barbed wire, no, there was police guards, constables, but it wasn't like a camp is, some people might think of a camp. From Belgaum, because of the numbers of people who eventually got there, it's probably the most common of all the camps to see camp letters. And retired Colonel Hilliard, whose name you see here, he signed a lot of these. He eventually got a hand stamp, but he manually signed a lot of letters. This one's going to Porto Alegre, Brazil. Very faint over here, you can see the Bombay sensor hand stamp and quite visibly the Bombay sensor label. So I think because this was going to Brazil, they probably chose to really take a good look at it. It's kind of an unusual address. Now, Bellary, you see, there are very few covers, as I explained. This one, the only reason why you know it's from Camp Bellary is it says Camp Bellary, prisoner of war letter. It's got a Bombay sensor. It's got no indication that it's a, you don't see the PC hand stamp, so it didn't go to London. This particular sensor mark was stopped in August 1916. The camp had already closed by April. So this is before April 1916. And the camp was open in February 1915. So during that period of time. But this is going from a missionary, Mrs. Rensselaer, to Walter Rensselaer, care of Reverend Walter in Switzerland. So some of the correspondence might only have prisoner of war letter, or maybe not even that, especially from the camps that were less formal. That being said, my friend Cliff came up with a cover that has this nice censored with Superintendent Bellary. This may be a unique example. I've not been able to determine whose initials these belong to. I couldn't find anything in the archives that would have suggested that there was a superintendent. So really don't know how to interpret this until we can get some further documentation. Now, I mentioned Dinapur as a camp, concentration camp. Here you had about 100 people held, and this is, men, women, and children for a couple of months. No fancy hand stamps for the camp, no camp stationery, but you do see the Dinapur cantonment. You see the post-free prisoners of war, Bombay censor stamp on a postcard, and this crayon mark here, that's typical of what a London censor might write. And there's a lot of TGM correspondence with that and some other initials as well. Now, Katapahar, for reasons I'm not quite sure, gets a military style I'm quite well card. I don't know if you're familiar with these, but during the war, you had these things that soldiers would fill out, and they couldn't write anything except that, and then they'd send it home, like a safe arrival card. So this is probably a safe arrival card for someone coming to Katapahar in northeast India. Another hill station, this is South India now, Kodi Canal, held about 50 women and children for about a year. This would have been like a series of boarding houses, if you will. People might go there for a vacation, not during the war, but during the war it housed enemy nationals. And you can see a variety of hand stamps here. Past censor Bombay, the past censor prisoner of war, and this past censor Kodi Canal. I believe there's only 2 covers with this hand stamp. Again, you don't expect a lot of mail to have survived. If 50 women and children, maybe 30 women, and they're writing a couple letters to their husbands, most likely who are in Ahmednagar. So letters home to Germany, few. There's a war on. A lot of these letters didn't survive. Very similar situation from the camp at Takhta. Here you have the camp had just opened a few weeks earlier, and it's signed in manuscript by W.T. Moore, and I guess those were pretty plum jobs for the retired military to be a superintendent. But again, small camps, very few mail. This is a letter going to Switzerland, and no indication that it had been sent to London as well. Not everybody, not all the civilians were treated equally. So here in this house, which is called the Grange, Europeans were held in other villas, not in this place. What was held here were the family of all 7 sons of Ayub Khan. He was the father, the grandfather was the ex-Amir of Kabul, who had the temerity to oppose the British during the Second Afghan War. So after they caught him, he's put under house arrest and brought to India, and he dies 1914. This is Ayub Khan. And his descendants are put under house arrest in North India, but when World War I gets really heated up, British are very concerned about whether Afghanistan would come into the war against them or not. They brought them to Yerkud, South India, held them incommunicado. There is no postal history. There is scant archival information, but there's enough to say there was like 50 plus held in this place. And eventually they get sent back to North India after the war. So here we are in Yerkud, nice postal stationery. You can see that it's printed up. It says 5,000 down here, 5,000 August 1st, 1918. There was two printings of this. Yerkud censor stamp and special cover for transmission overseas. This is a generic camp envelope. They're also found. You only know that it's from Yerkud from comments on the cover itself. Here's a Bombay postage stamp. This cover is going from Thailand to Mr. Rexhausen, who was worked as a pharmacist or as a government pharmacist in Thailand, a German, brought to India as a civil internee, and was sent to Yerkud, where men without families were sent. The family members went to Sholapur. And this is a scarce hand stamp. It says Superintendent Civil Camp Yerkud. It doesn't say censorship. It's more like a received mark. And it was only used for a month or two when the camp first opened. But my point on this cover is that it's going from the military side of Ahmednagar to the civil side in Yerkud. And Mr. Kissendorfer, he was a wealthy businessman who I guess aged out and left Ahmednagar, and likely a friend of his or a colleague sent him a card. Post office actually asked that all these cards say on prisoners of war service. They printed up a few, but obviously not all these used. You'll see these marks like the C54 and other rectangles. These are Dutch sorting marks going. This is going from Java and from Yerkud to Java, and there's a Yerkud postmark. So it's dropped off at the Indian office, the Indian post office, and sent there. I used to live in Wiesbaden, so when I saw this cover, I was quite excited and a little confused. If you look at it, a letter coming from Germany, it should come into Bombay and be censored and then moved over. But the ship must have stopped first in Madras for some reason or other. So we have a rather unusual Madras, unusual on a cover like this. It's not unusual censor hand stamp, but unusual going in that direction. And over here, it almost looks like a very faint Bombay stamp, but it can't be measured, it can be visualized. So we mentioned Sholapur. This appears to be two hand stamps because this particular hand stamp, this is J.R. Hill, the lieutenant colonel who's superintendent. And this is probably a separate hand stamp, but it's all inked in the same color. So I don't quite know what to make of it. And we have a Bombay censor hand stamp there as well. This hand stamp forwarded as a special case. This often refers to large letters or more frequent letters where the sender has been given special permission by the superintendent. Now, Mr. Krumbagel he, there's a letter addressed to him and sent from him, in theory, from Great Britain. He was a famous landscaper, he's interned in first in Ahmednagar and then moved to Irkut. I have no idea why this was sent, but this is dated May 1919. He's still in Irkut. He had the misfortune of being very pro-British. His wife was British, his children were British nationals, but he was interned. And then in World War II, he was interned again. So there's quite a archival history on him, and I was happy to have a cover with his name on it. So after the war, basically everybody's repatriated by the end of 1919. Some were exempt for humanitarian reasons. So spouse of a British or Indian civilian, they would stay. People who had no contact with Germany for decades or too ill to be transported, and those who were previously exempt from internment, like the nuns and the monks. But mail from repatriated missionaries to India, except going to government officials in India, was stopped for 5 years after the war. That tells you that they really, really wanted to rip out the missionaries completely, the German missionaries from India. So just as a postscript, one slide on Ottomans. Of course, these are Europeans, Arabs, Persians, Kurds, Armenians, all sorts of kinds of people. But in India, you had about 2,500 of them, virtually none of them interned. Only 50, and most of these were for humanitarian reasons. They were impoverished or otherwise needed to be interned. There was a couple of hundred Ottoman civilian servants who were brought to India and interned in military camps awaiting civilian prisoner exchange programs. And they were held at Bellary, which became a camp for Arab soldiers, Sumerpur, which was Arabs, Persians, and Armenians, and at Fayette Mio, Burma, for Turkish civilians. So the British kept everybody more or less ethnically segregated. It's not possible to distinguish between civilian and military prisoners in these camps unless you have the names of it. Remarkably, about 30,000 letters still remain undelivered. They're stored at the Red Crescent offices in Geneva. And post-COVID, I'd really like to make an effort to see if I can see them. Last slide is a postscript that there were Indians held in Germany as well. This pretty plain-looking postcard has the mark of prisoner of war, post-free. It's addressed to Alaheb Alibi, who worked for the Hansa line, and letters sent with a closing. It says, "I'm all man good. God save you and all your crew," and send a letter to my address. And he's got his address. And on the back is a letter written in Indian vernacular. I just would point out from a postal history point of view that domestic postage rate was required for mail to civilians and soldiers held in Germany. And my guess is that there were probably fewer than 200 Indians in Germany, most of whom were soldiers, sailors, and a few students that might have been at university at the time. So that sort of concludes the overview. I would only add that what the Indian government learned from the British in terms of internment is a lot of the rules, the laws, and how it's done is still in effect in India. And with that, I would turn it over to Markham.
Rob, first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for this very interesting and informative presentation with your personal knowledge on this subject of First World War period, internment mails in India. Since the subject is explained with great clarity, I don't have many questions. However, one curious question. Yerakud, you are mentioning as the German men were kept there, okay? And that too particularly are mentioning with age of 45.
Yes, these were men that aged out of military service in 1917.
Okay, do you have any further information regarding the age group of other camps, and also some more information that who were the prisoners and of which country's origin? India or Europe, etc., or something like that?
I have from the archives lists of people who were interned, what their ages were, children, women, men. It's not a complete list, so you can't say this is everybody. But for the civilian camps at Yerkud, at Takhta, at Katapahar, at Belgaum, and in part at Ahmednagar. I have those names and ages, yes, because that's in the Indian National Archives.
Okay, thank you. And Johan, we have the question in the Q&A box.
Oh.
Are you going to look for that?
Okay, I don't know how I do that.
I will tell you. There was first question is from Lars. He's wondering why there are no German censor cancels or German and Swiss arrival cancels on the letters.
Okay. It could be for the Swiss arrival cancels, they're on the verso, and I'm in the interest of timeliness, I've been shown the verso of most of these covers. The Germans, by and large, did not censor mail going into a prisoner of war camp because why bother? These people are locked up, and that information is, they don't. You know, you do see German censors on, of course, some but not all Indian prisoners of war. The Indians who were held at the Hauptmannlager generally got very favorable treatment. This was a jihad camp that the Germans had set up. But if you were a British officer in an Indian regiment, you would have your letters censored.
Okay. Another comment from Jimmy. Can you comment on the pre-printed postcard that you shared? And was it printed in languages other than English?
Yes, it was printed for the civil camps in German and English. World War II, of course, they expanded that to Italian, German, and English. For the military camps, German and English. Yeah, those are the two languages, because the Austrian language would have been, for the Turkish camps, you have Arabic, and I've only seen the Arabic. I can only imagine that there are, for this is military camps, that there are also other safe arrival card languages. It's just convenient.
Okay, we're going to move up the timeline a little bit and ask, how did the collapse of the Ottoman Empire affected what happened to the internees from there?
Wow, that's a great question. The British very quickly gained control of Saudi Arabia, or what is today Saudi Arabia. Of course, then was separate countries, many countries. And this is where they repatriated those that they wanted to get rid of, the troublemakers. They brought them to that area. They also brought them to Egypt. Of course, Egypt, the British had already taken over from the Ottomans years earlier, and then declared martial law. So that was, Egypt was not a problem. Taking over Mesopotamia, which is today's Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Israel. There, the Arabs, by and large, were very anti-Ottoman anyway. They were in revolt, led by Lawrence of Arabia and the Souths. And repatriation of prisoners of war back to that area of the world was not a problem, except later there was the Arab revolt against the British in 1921 and 22. And of course, in Egypt, there was the Muslim Brotherhood. And in India itself, there was, before the war, during the war, and after the war, Indian nationals were pressing, sometimes violently and sometimes civilly, to get the British out. This is a long story. I don't know if I addressed the question or not. I got kind of lost.
That's okay.
I have one short question for Robert. Robert, what was the situation in French and Portuguese settlements in India during this period?
Excellent question. Okay. For Portuguese India, you have two phases. You have a phase during the war when Portugal was a neutral country. And then, I may not have the exact date, but early in the war, 1915-ish, 1916 maybe, Portugal enters the war because the Germans sink some Portuguese ships. At that point, there's a shift in the relationship because Portugal's an ally now. You see Portuguese cemeteries on the Western Front. It was a very unpleasant experience for them in the war, as it was for most of the countries. The shift came with censorship. You see that when it was a neutral country, the British did all the censoring. And when it became an ally, the Portuguese asked to do their own, and the British acquiesced. So that would be one change. For France, the French settlements in India, there was no such censorship. It was always considered domestic mail. But letters coming from Indians, or letters addressed to Indians from anywhere in the world going into French India, was stopped and reviewed by the censors because they were concerned that Pondicherry and other places were places of refuge for Indian nationals and other people that the British considered enemies of the state.
Yes, indeed.
But I've been looking for a censored cover from Pondicherry to Pondicherry for a long time. I've not seen any. And I've spoken to people who collect French India and they don't have any either. So they may not have made markings.
I collect French settlements in India, and after your presentation, I will look in my collection. I will try to find out something. If I find something, I will send some scans to you.
That'd be excellent. Look for anything that's addressed to an Indian national, not to a European name.
Oh yeah, indeed. I got your point. Okay.
I think there's one other question. You may not know the answer because...
yeah, that came up recently.
Yeah, David asked, did the Germans ever return the 10th century statue of the Hindu goddess Draga? Is it Draga?
Durga.
Durga, okay. That was, you could tell I collect Nova Scotia, right? Which has been stolen from India. We may not know that.
I think the only way you'd have to like Google it, but there's a lot of things in German museums that have not been returned from a lot of places. That's true of all museums. The war booty is typically not returned. It's the Greeks about the Elgin marbles.
Well, guys, that was really great. I'd like to invite everyone now who's in the audience to come on over and talk to you some more. I'm going to give preference to anyone who raises their hand, so I could just pull you over. So I'm going to start. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again. Robert, anything to add?
No, I'm good. I appreciate everybody's patience, and you know, it's a subject that I'm very intense with, and for those of you who enjoyed it, I'm happy to be able to do it.
Yeah, and Mark, and thank you for staying up so late. This must be an ungodly hour for you right now.
Or getting up very early, whichever you did.
Yeah, it's 4 o'clock, 22 minutes past 4 early in the morning here.
Oh my gosh, wow.
But really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Well, you see some people coming in. If you want to put your video on, assuming it's appropriate to put your video on, of course, and feel free to unmute yourself and talk.
My name's Gordon Hardy. Thank you for the most excellent talk, Robert, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Most interesting and illuminating. On the packet rate, it was probably a maximum of 7 ounces, which is about 200 grams, but it may have been less, but 7 ounces would have been the maximum for a packet.
Yeah, I know from the British side that there was a number of postal notices about what could be done, but I don't know if the Indians used the same measurements, if you will. They had set the same standards.
I think they probably did, and there were probably UPU standards that they adopted anyway.
Robert, this is Dan Walker.
Oh, hi, Dan.
38 years ago, I got my start and flat away through the British Empire Study Group. And I have real fond memories of the meetings when I lived in New York of joining the group. Question for you. How far back does the Indian National Postal Museum have material?
I can't speak to that. I can tell you the National Archives goes back to the beginning of British rule.
Wow. Okay.
So I mean, but not a lot. Obviously, the more modern you get, the more material there is. But they have millions of documents that have been digitized. It's just going on their website. You get a password and a name, and you log on, and you can read to your heart's content.
Wow. Okay.
You mentioned the landscaper. Are there any stories that you came upon in this collection that besides that fascinates you or move you?
There's Mr. Rexhausen, who came in from Thailand, and he writes in the old style German script, which when I was in school, we were taught that script, but it's been too many years and it's very hard to read in print, but it's almost impossible with the hand. My son, who lives in Austria, he was able to work it through, and basically it's a letter that he's writing home to his sister, saying how disfigured he is from his disease and how dependent he is on things, and he's wondering whether his family would be willing to take him back. And I just thought it was such a sad letter. So yes, you have some stories, people being separated. One woman from German East Africa, she's not allowed to join the other ladies because there's no room for her. So she's sitting in a hotel for like 6 weeks, and I'm sure it's not a posh hotel, waiting to just restart her life, even as a prisoner. So yeah, it's being held captive is never a pleasant story. It's life interrupted.
Hey, Robert, quick question. Were these internment camps used again in World War II? Or?
Some were. Mednagar briefly, Yerkud, Katapahar, they were used. There may be, Cody Canal was definitely used. But, for short periods of time while they concentrated people and then moved them to more modern facilities. So you do have you have for Mednagar, the Boer War, World War I and World War II, and there are people who just focus on a Mednagar prisoner of war, civil internment postal history, because it's very concentrated in that one town.
How do they manage dietary restrictions?
Well, for the Germans and the Austrians, they probably didn't get enough food that they would like. But generally, the Red Cross made inspections, and the food was actually pretty good. They had, in most places, they were given either food prepared or they were given an allowance to purchase food. So the Red Cross never found that an issue. In camps that were holding Ottoman prisoners, those would be military camps. And again, then Hague Convention gave them greater protection. And yes, there was separate diets for Muslim and non-Muslim internees, as there were for Indian soldiers that went to hospitals. There had to be a Muslim hospital and one for Hindus. It's very, very different. And who served the food and who prepared the food for the Hindus was also a problem because of the caste system. There was a Muslim caste system too. I don't know a lot about it, but they also had adopted this.
Hmm.
What's cool is this particular subject is you have the Red Cross reports from many of the camps. And you can read the original in French or the English versions. The French versions are always longer. I don't understand why, but they have more to say in French. And I mean, they actually have more detail too. They broke out for one of the military camps, how many letters were sent by Muslims, how many by Jews and Christians and different groups, and whether they were civil or whether they were military. And that's where I get my 4 letters in and 4 letters out estimate, because that seems to be not an absolute number, but something across camps that seemed to be a reasonable estimate. So one of the things I'd like to do going forward is actually to use the knowledge of the number of internees, adult internees, and the number of months that they were interned. And I have that information, and an estimate of 8 pieces of correspondence, and using that to get a relative scarcity for all of these internment places, and if not an absolute, at least a relative. So
What about education for children?
I'm sorry?
Education of children.
There was a German school at Belgaum, the family camp, where you had a lot of children with a German-speaking teacher. The British were suspicious of it, but eventually allowed it. But it's a problem when you intern families. And initially, the husbands and wives from Belgaum were separated, but at no point in World War I were the children separated from their parents. At least in India, yeah.
Mark, and do you use the archive also for your research?
Yes, I do use the archives for my research, and I have published 2 very important and serious studies so far, out of which one I have published the book as well on the 1929 airmail stamps of India.
Yes, seen that. Yeah.
Second subject I study with full of interest, that is the first issue of India, 1854, the 2 annas green stamp, and in which also I use the archive. Sometimes it's very useful, and some information which in general not aware with comes up surprisingly.
The archive in some of the major cities is not digitally available. It's just the National Archive that's digitally available.
Yeah.
And you have different information is held.
Yeah.
Well, I wish we could all have a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or something, but at the Collectors Club, we always have that. We have a nice social room, and people can sit down and talk. It's really a pleasant experience, and I'm waiting for post-COVID to rejoin it.
Ryan's ahead of you.
Have you been able to turn to anybody's memoirs to help you on this project?
Actually, there's a set of correspondence between a husband and wife who eventually get repatriated. There's some family web pages, if you will, where they discuss the internment. There's very little, and there's, like I say, a couple of books written about the Golconda experience, just, having to be, forcibly leave a country that you may have been living there for 20 years. It's pretty unnerving, especially going home to a war zone. A lot of them were much worse off going back to Germany than staying in India. Germany was being starved during the war, so it ended very unpleasantly. There's one book I know written by a censor, a man called Fitzgerald Lee, John Fitzgerald Lee. He was a captain in the Indian Army Reserve, and he was a censor in Karachi, in Aden, and Madras, and Danishkoti, which is the southern tip of India. He wrote a book, really scathing and praising. He praised himself, and he damned everybody else in the censor group. Sort of a self-serving book, but he's actually published other military books and religious books. So he's a published author, but his censored book, there's only 2 copies that the World Catalog lists, and both copies are in the British Library. But I have a digital copy because I spent a lot of time taking pictures of pages.
Mm.
Rob,
Yeah.
Danusko, we call it as the Key West, the Indian version of Key West.
Oh,
I'm sure that is very well aware of Key West since he lives in Florida.
I am now going to speak for Greg. He asked, he doesn't have a microphone, so he asked me to be his mouthpiece. Are you aware of the League of Nations Refugee Organization, if they had involvement with the repatriation of any individuals that had been interned during the war of these camps?
the internees were brought back by, for the Ottoman internees, and I'm talking both military and civilian because they can't be separated, but most of the civilians were traded during the war. So they went back home by ship, probably to Egypt, and then from Egypt picked up by a neutral carrier and brought to Turkey or wherever they were headed. For the Germans at the end of the war, they were brought back by ships available because British ships could then enter Germany because the war was over. The Treaty at Versailles was signed in June 1919, but didn't come into effect until January of 1920. And that's when officially everybody was supposed to be repatriated. Actually, the British wanted to get them out faster. It's a question of money. And if you follow the money in the archives, you can actually see what it cost them to send the Turkish people back to Turkey. They have a complete, how much does Turkey owe us for repatriating their people? So I don't know if that answers the question, but nothing specific about the League of Nations, no. This was done by the British government and Indian government.
Thank you. And that was very interesting.
Folks, I'm gonna have to leave. I thank you very much, Robert. Very nice meeting you. And I look forward to the next talk. Thank you for inviting me.
Hope to see you there too.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.
It would be funny to me, it would be ironic to me as somebody whose life was saved because they were in the internment camp. Like if you were Armenian, Indian internment camp, and you were still there when the Turks really went to work on them.
There's a piece in the archives that talk about the Armenian complaints that they're not getting any mail back from their homes. And at that time, this is like 1915, early 1916, it was pretty clear, at least to the British, that terrible things had been going on, but the extent of it was not really well known at that time. People interned, they would send letters to their family and not get anything back. It must have been very, very difficult to understand really what had happened. Yeah, a lot of history. Between 1914 and 1924, the whole world changed. And that's why I studied the postal history of that period so much. And unfortunately, a lot of it hasn't changed, from that. We're still fighting those wars.
When is your next talk? I know you're usually a very...
Next talk from my side will be in the APS STEM chat, but they are finalizing the schedule. So it will be on one of the Indian subject. I will be presenting my talk. And I already had 2 talks, actually, if anybody wants to see it, on the 1929 Airmail Stamps of India and the 1854 Tuanas with the American Philatelic Society. Is there on their YouTube channel.
Oh, terrific. Thank you.
My last question. Did anybody internees ask to not be repatriated?
Yes. There were a lot of people who had no contact with Germany for years. There were people who were in their 60s. they were, maybe born in Germany and brought to India as a child. And the British basically did not repatriate them. The only people who had forced repatriation were missionaries. And again, it's for the reasons I explained. A lot of them, also the missionaries, the younger ones, had positions in the German Army Reserve and the Austrian Army Reserve. The Austrians refused to make a parole statement, so they stayed locked up, whereas a lot of the Germans were allowed to at least leave the camp on a parole basis. They could walk about. But yeah, you have also, when a British woman was to marry a German national, she takes the nationality of her husband. So she was considered German, but she may have educated her children in Britain, and her children may even been in fighting in World War I for the British. So these were all taken up, and there's dozens of examples in the archives detailing, and in fact, one table where they detail each and every exemption from internment and repatriation. So they had a lot of information on that.
Hey, Ed, how are you doing? We have Ed Grabowski, a British study group, and Lou Pataki, who's also joined us.
Actually, I've been sitting here in true British tradition, drinking a glass of tea.
Oh.
Okay, and I would like to offer a toast to tonight's speaker with my sincerest thanks for a great presentation.
You're very welcome.
Robert.
Chin chin.
Wow. I wish I had something stronger than
I'd just like to thank you for the invitation. It's very good.
Now, I'm just the next one about the small queen stamps. I'm just wondering, are they referring to the stamps or the size of the queen?
No, I'm going to dress up in costume, right? No, and I think it's it's stamps and it's Canadian, so.
Right, because the thing is, Queen Victoria, and it could go either way.
Well, it's the small head. The stamp has a small head, and then they later enlarged it, I guess. So you have two series, and B&A is the British North American Act, which created Canada.
Remember the Tom Thumb said to Queen Victoria, supposedly said to Queen Victoria when she said he was really short, he goes, well, you don't exactly reach the top shelf yourself.
Oh my goodness.
That would be awful.
I'm sure she was not amused.
Supposedly she laughed.
Wow. Yeah, Tom Thumb's house was in Bethel, Connecticut, where I used to live. So it was really fun to listen to all the P.T. Barnum stories and things like that. Yeah, quite a character. Well,
I would like to mention
I'm off to supper. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night, Ed.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you again, Markin.
Yeah, what I was going to say that I have a very long association with the British Empire Study Group. I had an opportunity to present one of my talk on the Danish settlements in India, and for which I flew from India all the way to New York, and I presented my display at the Collectors Club of New York. Wow. So this is after exactly 10 years, I have an opportunity to get associated with the British Empire Study Group again. And wow. Thank you very much for inviting me. And Robert, thank you very much again for the wonderful and informative presentation on this fascinating subject.
It's very kind, thank you.
Okay, do you want to go and eat? And you're going to go to sleep, I hope.
Sure, I'm falling in sleep now.
Okay, so we'll say good night to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
So see you guys in a week.
See you in a week.
Yep.
Okay.